Wish We Could Turn Back Time by Girlinpink44. Chapter 13. School Visit. When he had been laying in a hospital bed after the events in Siberia, Tony had had a lot of time where he was left alone to his thoughts. Rhodey was still in Germany. It would take weeks before they were willing to move him. He and Pepper was still at a break at that point, and he had brushed off Peter. In those moments, he had been surrounded by what could have been. Regrets, the idea that hindsight was 20/20. He had a lot of ideas of things he could have done differently. Of those had been not following up on a lead he had been given some time after New York. He had been approached by someone about a school for gifted children. He had meant to follow it up and check it out. The fact that hindsight was 20/20 was a benefit here. One he was taking full advantage of as he drove through Worcestershire country, New York, on his way to Xavier's school for gifted children. In the SUV he had plenty of tech to offer as a peace offering, as he was coming here unannounced. It was a risk. Mutants largely stuck to themselves. In fact, it had taken Jarvis days to find the place. But as he pulled up to the gate and buzzed the bell, he hoped that this gamble was worth it.
This is a private campus. I'm aware. I apologize for not making an appointment. But I need to speak with Dr. Charles Xavier. Dr. Xavier is a very busy man. Can you tell him Dr. Tony Stark is here to speak with him on a matter of intergalactic importance?
There was a pause. Tony wondered if they wouldn't believe him. It had been a bit since he had dropped his doctorate into a conversation. People tended to forget he had one. Finally, the voice returned.
Dr. Xavier will see you. Please drive up to the main building.
Tony let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding as the gates opened. He drove his way down the drive and soon saw the grounds of the school. There were students throughout the grounds, some taking advantage of the weather. Some were reading, the younger ones playing. Still others were working on their abilities. They were in a place where they could be free and could be accepted. It was beautiful, and it was something to consider when approaching the Accords for a second time. These kids, and the adults like them around the world, deserved to be accepted. Maybe they could find ways to do just that. After all, enhanced and mutates were starting to be accepted, before it all imploded thanks to Ultron, so there was hope that it could happen. He pulled up to the front of the school and stepped out of the car. A man, large, blue and hairy, came out of the door.
Dr. Stark? Yes, Tony circled the car. Dr. Hank McCoy.
The man held out his hand, and Tony shook it without hesitation, an action he could see rather surprised the man.
You're taking things rather well. Trust me, Dr. McCoy. If you've seen half the stuff I had, this wouldn't remotely faze you either.
Dr. McCoy laughed.
I am officially intrigued. Is that part of whatever it is that you drove up here for, unannounced? Sorry about that. I've got a limited window to stay in New York without raising eyebrows, and this needs to be discussed sooner rather than later. He is ready to see you. How many students do you have? We have 50 enrolled at present. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. Some mutants decide to stay where they are, while others come here to develop their gifts and become accepted.
Tony tucked that away.
I've got around 20 laptops at the SUV for you all. I wasn't sure how many to bring, but I figured it would be a good start.
Dr. McCoy paused.
Why? Part of the explanation, I'm afraid.
One I am fascinated to hear. A voice came inside an office. Dr. McCoy paused at the door and waved him in.
Dr. Stark? Tony's fine, Dr. Xavier. Thank you for seeing me unannounced like this. I understand you have a school to run, among other things.
If you're Tony, I'm Charles. Could I interest you in some tea? Coffee, perhaps?
Coffee would be wonderful.
It took a few minutes for them to get settled, and Tony wasn't sure how to start.
Sorry if this seems intrusive, but I was told that you are a telepath. Perhaps the most powerful one on the planet.
I am. Charles nodded, but at the moment, I'm not looking into your head. If that's what has you concerned.
But you could and determine that what is there is true and not made up.
I could. Tony let out a breath.
See, here's the thing. That might be the easiest way to start this conversation, but I've had some bad experiences with people in my head, so the idea makes me a bit cautious.
I'll let you direct me wherever you want me, if that would help. Charles wheeled around the desk. It's completely up to you. We can have this discussion like this if you want.
It's easier to show you, Tony nodded. I'll try and give you the highlights, and then answer questions that you have.
Charles nodded and closed his eyes. Show me what you need to. Tony closed his eyes and pushed him images of the Iron Man suit, of the press conference he'd have in a few months, of the expo, of the Battle of New York, what he saw in the wormhole. He showed them the aftermath, the fall of S.H.I.E.L.D., Ultron, the Accords, the Civil War, Spider-Man, the first round with Thanos, the devastating loss, the final battle, and his appearance back in time. Both men leaned back in their respective chairs, catching their breaths. Tony seemed to snap out of it first. After all, this is a fair bit less for him to process.
Can I tell you a story, Tony?
Charles finally spoke up.
Of course. The year was 1973, and there was a lot happening. The war with Vietnam had just ended. The anti-mutant sentiment was on the rise, and I was in the middle of a personal crisis. But a man came back with a similar tale to yours. He travelled in time.
Charles nodded.
I got a glimpse of that future, of a future me, of what could have been. It was a nightmare, horrific. But thanks to his journey, we were able to stop that future from occurring. He alone carries the weight of that journey, as only I saw a glimpse. Would he be open to talking with me? It might be interesting to share stories of our various dystopias.
Tony had mixed feelings of there being other people who had shared experiences. How bad had that future been? What was so bad that had happened? How do you live with what never happened?
I can discuss it with him and let you know.
Charles paused and sat taking a sip of his tea.
I'm assuming you came to ask for the aid of the X-Men. I see we weren't involved in your original timeline. Yes and no.
Tony looked out of the open window. A good view of the kids playing soccer on the field.
I came for you. For them. For my kid. The Spider Kid. Is he mutant? Mutate? Born spider, had his DNA altered by a radioactive spider. How much of his DNA altered? He's 2% spider. Gives him some interesting abilities. Perhaps I could bring him on a visit. He'd love to meet you, and maybe being around kids who are unique might be good for him. He remembers.
Tony nodded.
He does. There's a lot of pain there. He saw me die. I saw him die. But that makes what we have that much more special.
Charles nodded.
How did you come back?
Tony pulled out his phone and set it on the table between them, and pulled up the holographic display he had prepared for this question.
When the Big Bang happened, 6 stones came into existence. Each stone has dominion and can manipulate a part of reality. There's power, mind, soul, time, space, and reality.
Fascinating. Charles leaned forward, the eager gleam that Tony knew all too well in his eyes.
A man named Thanos, from a planet called Titan, went on a quest to find and claim all 6 stones.
To what end?
To snap half of the universe out of existence, to make more resources for those who survived.
Tony took a long sip of his coffee. The images of people turning to dust being one that would forever haunt his nightmares.
As you showed me. That kind of loss would be devastating. The stones agree with you, Doc. Hence why there's a reset. One I plan to take full advantage of. There's something here that can benefit you and your kind as well. And that is? The Sokovia Accords. I want to bring them up again. Possibly not until New York happens, when people see how we can help, but before we cause so much damage.
And how does that help us?
Have a seat at the table. When discussions begin, mutants can be at the table along with the mutates. I have a representative in mind for that group. along with accountability. We can use the document to ensure your people have rights.
Charles seemed to consider this. There's another faction I would need to reach out to. Would you be open to having this discussion again?
If I need to. These kids could finish growing up in a world where they're protected outside of my school.
Tony nodded.
They deserve it just as much as any other kid. So does mine. I'll be protecting him with this too.
I cannot commit to something without discussing it with the others. Charles seemed to be in thought at the implications of Tony's earlier statement. Join me for a quick tour while you're here?
I'd be honoured.
Charles wheeled himself out, and Tony fell into step beside him. I opened the school in 1965. Since then, attendance has been up and down. There was a period towards the end of Vietnam where we were closed for a bit. As I said, I was dealing with things, and sadly not very well.
If anyone gets unhealthy coping mechanisms, it's me.
Tony thought back to the way he had dealt with a lot of his past trauma. If he was honest, that was a good explanation for the majority of his partying decade. I imagine so. Charles led him to an elevator. They passed some kids who eyed the pair. The headmaster made sure to pause and greet each one, asking them questions about their schoolwork. Now, the part of your discussion that we haven't talked about is here downstairs. The elevator slid down, and Tony couldn't help but grin at the underground hideout he didn't have to smoke out. As a rule, the X-Men primarily get involved when issues that cause a cessation of peace between ourselves and humans, or if the situation involves other mutants. Your situation qualifies on multiple levels. The elevator doors opened, and Tony found himself in a hallway. Now, to our left is a room that houses a device that I'm sure a mechanic's side of you will drool over. The pair made their way to a door that sat at the end of the room. Charles opened a door and entered. This is Cerebro. With this, I can use my abilities to track anyone on the planet and amplify my abilities.
For example, I could be in Malibu, and you here, and you could read my mind?
Tony was torn. On one hand, the idea of a device that could read anyone's mind on the planet just sat in the basement of a school was terrifying. But Charles had been right when he said that the mechanic side of him was drooling at the idea of a tech being able to accomplish such a feat. You could. I very sparingly use it.
It's powered by electricity?
Charles nodded.
You made this?
With assistance from Hank. He's a rather handy engineer in his own right. Tony ran a hand through his hair as Charles wheeled to the side to let Tony examine the tech. There had been this amazing resource sitting here the whole time? And he wasn't talking about Cerebro. He was talking about Charles, Hank, and whomever else was the X-Men. Jarvis and he couldn't get a hold of a solid answer on that. There was a whole community that had been affected by what occurred during the so-called Civil War, and Tony had turned a blind eye to them. Did that make him no better than Cap? He examined the machine, curious as to how it worked.
You can find anyone. Could I trouble you for a demonstration?
Charles nodded, putting on a helmet device and adjusting some knobs before pushing some buttons. The walls of the room lit up with a picture of the globe and lights. In some places it was highly concentrated, and in others it was looser.
Wow!
Indeed. Who am I looking for?
Well, I've been accused of being a helicopter parent, so let's look for one of the kids. Peter Parker. The Spider Child. One and the same.
At least he knew that Peter would get a kick out of this when he told him about the tech. Peter would probably drool at the idea, both of Charles Xavier himself and of this device. New York City?
Yes.
I found him. He's in school. In recess, it seems. Charles's commentary held a fond tone.
He's probably hanging out with his best friend, Ned. They just found out they both remember everything that happened.
Indeed. At the moment, the two seem to be discussing Droney.
Tony laughed. It was a drone I snuck into Peter's suit to help him with surveillance.
Ah, well, the two are conspiring to make one for you. They feel you'll finish the suit soon and don't want you going without backup.
And since I've banned Peter from being that backup until he hits puberty...
Sorry for intruding, young Peter. I am a friend. My name is Charles. I'm with your dad?
Tell him I say hi, Roo.
Charles relayed the message and chuckled. He would like me to tell you not to call him that in the front of cool people who can read his mind. Tony laughed.
My apologies.
Tony shook his head. How did you know I was there, Peter? There was a pause. Your sense?
His spidey sense! I didn't even think about that being a factor. Oddly, it never came up. At least before I died.
The scene where Peter got hit by a train flashed through his mind. Another trauma that his death caused. Another thing that absolutely would not happen this time around. Tony. He shook his head, clearing his thoughts as he focused back into the present, instead of a timeline that would never be to find the device had been turned off, and Charles was watching him. Are you okay?
Something that will never happen. Sometimes even I forget just what that kid is capable of. He's the future, Charles.
I see that. You'll need to bring him up. Or perhaps we can meet next time I'm in the city. In the meantime, shall we continue our tour? The two left the room and headed past the elevator and into a whole wing. There was a gym, a lab, and a giant hangar. A jet sat parked in it, and Tony whistled.
Good to know what the competition is.
Charles chuckled. I'm sure Hank will love the compliment.
Absolutely.
Tony turned to see the blue man he had met earlier come into the hangar.
I have to hand it to you. If you ever want to leave here, come and talk to me if you want a job. Hank laughed. I'm good here. Charles and I have been through a lot together. Fair enough.
Tony looked at the jet.
One of the biggest disadvantages is that I have to invent everything again. I can't just go where I was, because I can only plausibly blow minds, but only so much. What are you saying?
Hank turned to the man. He's like Logan, though slightly different circumstances.
From what I've heard about his experiences, we both saw versions of the world basically ending.
Tony was rather impressed at how flippant he sounded about the whole thing, that technically had only been just over a week ago as far as he was concerned.
You're kidding me. So had we met before?
Hank was curious.
Unfortunately, no. Past me was an idiot, who didn't realise all the resources he had. Hindsight is 20/20 though, and when you've been sent back 15 years, you've got a ton of it. Wow. Can I ask what happened?
Tony stuck his hands into his pockets. Not dissimilar to how President Bartlett did it in the West Wing.
Half of the universe gone. Like that.
He snapped, something he hadn't done a lot in the last 5 years. He hadn't even been present when the snap happened. That was on Earth, and he had been stranded on that forsaken, dead planet. Tony! Tony took a few deep breaths.
Sorry.
Don't apologise. Charles's voice was quieter, softer. It took a few more breaths for Tony to calm down and fully shake Titan out of his mind.
Logan does that sometimes too, Hank muttered. Why can't the future ever be good? He fixed his.
Tony looked at the pair. Instead of answering, Charles pulled out a phone, pressed a few buttons and brought it to his ear. Can you come down to the hangar? There's someone who needs to meet you. The idea that there was someone else out there, from a different future? The way he travelled back was different from yours. He was sent back by a mutant and then woke up in a new timeline.
So we didn't have to relive the in-between years again?
Correct. It was a few minutes and another cup of coffee later before a man who had several inches on Tony walked in. He was dressed the way that both felt would be in touch with the current era, but had a feeling of being from a different time.
You asked me to calm down, Professor?
The man spoke with a slight Canadian accent.
I'm assuming it has something to do with Tony Stark is here. I'm Logan, by the way. I know your father back in the day. Met him at World War II.
Tony stared at the man who looked to be around his age.
How old are you? 138, give or take a year. The man grinned
and held out his hand, which Tony shook.
Nice to meet you, Stark. Tony.
The man nodded.
What's going on? I thought you were out of the game after your press conference last week. I've been told you and I have something in common. That is?
Tony looked at the man, seeing the guarded look in his eyes as they studied each other.
We both saw the world almost end. Logan's eyes grew wide. You're from the future? A future, not yours. And not the same method either. How did you get back? Infinity Stones. 6 rocks who help govern forces of the universe. They decided I needed a do-over. I hear that you got sent back as a warning. More or less.
The man looked away.
So there's another future where everything goes to shit. Oh yeah. What happened? Half the universe got wiped out.
That got Logan's attention, and for a second he seemed to be thinking that over. The other 2 mutants also seemed to be weighing the room.
How can I help stop it? There's not a lot to be done now. I'm in a bit of a holding pattern for a few years, until something happens in 2012. The best I can do is assemble allies and be ready. What's coming?
Charles turned to Stark.
Is that New York?
Tony nodded, and then turned to the non-telepaths in the room.
An alien army is going to come through a portal that will be opened by an Asgardian right over New York City. Asgardian? You're talking Norse mythology.
Hank looked like he wasn't sure what to think.
They're real. Loki is a piece of work and Thor has a small obsession with Pop-Tarts.
Tony wondered if there was anything he could do to help ease some of the pain that Thor felt in losing his people. He couldn't fix everything, and he was fairly certain he couldn't stop that from happening. But maybe he could warn Thor? Help him find a way to save more of his people? Could his mum be spared? That was a can of worms he wouldn't open at that moment.
They're real!
Hank laughed.
Beyond that, Charles and I have already talked about something that will affect you all, but not for a few more years.
Tony looked at the trio.
I had heard of your existence, but ignored it in the previous timeline. For that, I'm sorry.
What's in the past cannot be undone, but you've been given a chance to fix your mistakes. Something that one doesn't get often. Charles smiled. The fact that you came to us now perhaps means we will get the recognition we've been avoiding, but perhaps need. The group looked at each other, and while they didn't know everything that had happened, Tony felt like his load had lightened, knowing there were yet more allies. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. I really like this. I don't know too much about the X-Men, but I know a few bits from the odd comic I read at school and a couple of episodes that were randomly on TV at times. I'm lucky I've got a good memory for this kind of thing, but you know, because I didn't really pay much attention, I don't have that much in my mind when it comes to this. Anyway, I really like what they're doing here. And him contacting Peter through a telepath who's projecting his abilities. That's funny. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.